silver Mustang cuts through morning clouds above occupied France. Below, the countryside stretches endlessly, dotted with towns that have forgotten the sound of church bells. Above, somewhere in that pale December sky of 1944, death waits with German wings. The pilot adjusting his oxygen mask doesn't know that historians will later call this moment part of the greatest air war ever fought. He knows only the hum of his Merlin engine and the weight of responsibility pressing against his shoulders. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Clarence Eugene Anderson, though everyone calls him Bud, has flown more than 100 combat missions without taking a single hit. Not even a scratch on his aircraft. Some say it's skill, others whisper about luck. But what happens when a man seems to dance between bullets while his friends fall around him? What separates the untouchable from the unlucky? Auburn, California, sits in the foothills where gold miners once panned streams and dreamed of fortunes. By the 1920s, when Clarence Eugene Anderson entered the world, those dreams had settled into something quieter. Small-town rhythms, honest work, and the kind of character that emerges from knowing your neighbors and keeping your word. The boy everyone called Bud grew up watching barn swallows dart between telephone wires, their aerobatics a daily reminder that the sky held possibilities. His father worked steady jobs, his mother kept a garden, and the Anderson household ran on the principles that built America's backbone. You earned what you got, you helped your neighbors, and you faced whatever came your way without complaint. Auburn's main street buzzed with Model T Fords and the occasional airplane passing overhead, usually headed somewhere more important. But young Bud would stop whatever he was doing to watch those distant wings disappear into the horizon. Something about flight captured his imagination in ways that ground-bound activities never could. While other boys collected baseball cards, Bud sketched aircraft designs on the margins of his school books. The Great Depression arrived when Bud was still learning to drive, but rural California had always known lean times. Families like the Andersons adapted without drama. They planted bigger gardens, repaired everything twice, and found entertainment in conversations around kitchen tables. These years taught Bud patience, resourcefulness, and an appreciation for simple pleasures that would serve him well when life became considerably more complicated. High school brought clearer focus to his aviation interests. Bud read everything he could find about flying, from technical manuals to adventure stories about World War I aces. He understood that becoming a pilot required more than dreams. It demanded precision, discipline, and the ability to make split-second decisions while managing complex machinery. These weren't qualities that came naturally to everyone, but they seemed to align perfectly with his temperament. December 7th, 1941, changed everything for young Americans. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed peaceful Sunday mornings into recruitment office lines, and Bud Anderson found himself among thousands of men suddenly eager to serve their country. But unlike many who enlisted in whatever branch would take them fastest, Bud had a specific goal. He wanted to fly. The Army Air Forces needed pilots desperately, but they also demanded high standards. Flight training was notorious for washing out candidates who couldn't handle the physical demands, the mental pressure, or the technical complexity of military aircraft. Bud approached the challenge with characteristic calm determination, treating each phase of training as another skill to master rather than an ordeal to survive. Primary training began in California, where civilian instructors taught the basics of flight in simple aircraft, like the PT-17 Stearman. The yellow biplanes looked almost quaint, but they were demanding teachers that revealed whether a candidate had the instincts for three-dimensional thinking. Some students froze when their instructor suddenly cut the engine, simulating emergency landings. Others panicked during aerobatic maneuvers, losing track of which way was up. Bud discovered that flying felt natural to him. Not easy, but logical in ways that made sense once he grasped the underlying principles. Advanced training brought more powerful aircraft and increasingly complex scenarios. Students learned formation flying, instrument navigation, and aerial gunnery, skills that would prove essential in combat. The washout rate remained high, but Bud consistently earned marks that placed him among the top candidates. His instructors noted his smooth handling of aircraft and his ability to remain composed under pressure. The transition from trainer aircraft to operational fighters represented another significant leap. The P-39 Airacobra was Bud's first taste of a true combat aircraft, with its unusual configuration placing the engine behind the pilot and its cannon firing through the propeller hub. The Airacobra had a mixed reputation. Some pilots loved its ground attack capabilities, while others criticized its high-altitude performance. But for Bud, it was a chance to understand how military aircraft translated power into tactical advantage. The crossing to England aboard a troop transport gave Bud Anderson time to contemplate what lay ahead. The Atlantic in 1943 was still a dangerous place, with German submarines lurking beneath gray waves. But the greater uncertainty was what awaited on the other side. Europe had been at war for nearly 4 years, and the stories filtering back from combat veterans spoke of aerial battles unlike anything the world had previously witnessed. The 357th Fighter Group was establishing itself at Leiston, a former Royal Air Force base in Suffolk. The flat countryside of East Anglia had been transformed into a massive aviation complex, with runways carved from farmland and Quonset huts sprouting like metal mushrooms. The sound of aircraft engines had become the region's constant soundtrack, as American bomber and fighter groups prepared for the campaign that would ultimately decide the war's outcome. Bud's first glimpse of operational reality came during routine patrols over the English Channel. These missions were relatively safe. The Luftwaffe rarely ventured over British waters in daylight anymore, but they provided essential experience in formation flying and radio procedures. More importantly, they allowed new pilots to adjust to the psychological weight of carrying live ammunition while flying over enemy territory. The bomber escort missions began almost immediately. American heavy bombers were striking targets deep inside occupied Europe, but they needed fighter protection to survive concentrated German interception attempts. Bud found himself flying alongside formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, massive aircraft that looked almost impossibly vulnerable despite their defensive armament. His first encounter with enemy aircraft came during an escort mission over northern France. German fighters approached from high altitude, diving toward the bomber formation with tactics refined through years of combat experience. Bud watched his flight leader break away to engage, then found himself following almost instinctively. The engagement lasted only minutes, but it provided his first taste of aerial combat's intensity. The sudden appearance of enemy aircraft, the rapid maneuvering to gain tactical advantage, and the brief moments when trigger discipline could mean the difference between victory and disaster. That first mission also taught him about loss. One of his squadron mates failed to return from the engagement, becoming another name on the lengthening casualty lists. Bud began to understand that surviving combat required more than individual skill. It demanded situational awareness, tactical thinking, and sometimes the kind of luck that had nothing to do with preparation. When the North American P-51 Mustang arrived at Leiston, it represented more than just another aircraft. It was the tool that would finally give American fighters the range and performance needed to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Bud Anderson's first flight in a Mustang revealed an aircraft that seemed purpose-built for his flying style, combining speed, maneuverability, and endurance in ways that previous fighters had struggled to match. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine provided smooth, reliable power that could pull the aircraft through virtually any tactical situation. Its sleek lines weren't just aesthetically pleasing, they represented aerodynamic efficiency that translated directly into combat advantage. But most importantly, for long-range escort missions, the Mustang could carry enough fuel to accompany bombers to targets that had previously been beyond fighter range. Bud quickly established himself as one of the squadron's most reliable pilots. His aircraft handling was smooth and precise. His formation flying was textbook perfect, and his tactical judgment consistently placed him in positions where he could support his teammates while avoiding unnecessary risks. These qualities didn't make headlines, but they made him the kind of pilot that others wanted flying alongside them when things became complicated. His first confirmed victory came during an escort mission over Germany. A formation of Messerschmitt Bf 109 attempted to break through to the bombers, and Bud found himself in position to intercept. The engagement developed quickly, a brief maneuvering duel that tested both pilots' skills and aircraft capabilities. When it was over, the German fighter was spiraling toward the ground, and Bud was left with the strange mixture of satisfaction and regret that came with success in aerial combat. Word of his victory spread through the squadron, but Bud's reaction was characteristically understated. He filed his combat report, discussed the engagement with intelligence officers, and prepared for the next mission. This matter-of-fact approach to aerial combat would become his signature. He never seemed to get caught up in the mythology that surrounded successful fighter pilots. The victories accumulated steadily throughout 1944. Each engagement taught Bud something new about aerial tactics, enemy capabilities, or his own reactions under pressure. He learned to recognize the distinctive silhouettes of German fighters at maximum visual range, to anticipate their tactical moves, and to position himself for successful attacks while minimizing exposure to return fire. The aerial battles over occupied Europe in 1944 represented the culmination of military aviation's rapid evolution. Both sides flew aircraft that had been continually refined through years of combat experience, and the pilots who survived long enough to become veterans possessed skills that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Bud Anderson faced opponents who were equally skilled and often more experienced. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots had been fighting since the war's beginning, and many had accumulated victory totals that dwarfed anything achieved by American pilots. But they were also operating under increasingly difficult circumstances. Fuel shortages, limited training for replacement pilots, and the growing pressure of fighting a war on multiple fronts. One engagement over central Germany illustrated the chess-like nature of aerial combat. Bud spotted a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s climbing toward the bomber stream from below. Rather than diving directly into the attack, he positioned his flight to intercept their climb, forcing the German pilots to choose between breaking off their attack or accepting combat at a disadvantage. When the German leader chose to fight, the engagement developed into a classic turning battle that tested both formations' tactical cohesion. The German pilots were skilled, but they made a crucial error by allowing themselves to be drawn into individual dogfights rather than maintaining formation integrity. Bud exploited this by supporting his wingmen while avoiding prolonged individual engagements. When the battle ended, 2 German fighters had been destroyed, and all the American aircraft returned safely to base. Another memorable encounter occurred during a sweep mission over northern France. Bud was flying alone after becoming separated from his formation when he encountered a single Messerschmitt Bf 109 at medium altitude. The German pilot was obviously experienced, using vertical maneuvers and energy management techniques that suggested considerable combat time. The duel lasted nearly 10 minutes, with both aircraft maneuvering for position while trying to conserve ammunition and fuel. The decisive moment came when the German pilot made a slight tactical error, pulling too tight in a climbing turn and bleeding off excess airspeed. Bud recognized the opportunity immediately, converting his slight energy advantage into firing position. His burst was brief but accurate, and the German fighter rolled over and dove toward the ground in a terminal spiral. These individual victories were satisfying, but Bud understood that the real measure of success was mission accomplishment. His primary responsibility was protecting American bombers, not accumulating personal victory totals. This perspective helped him maintain tactical discipline even during the most intense engagements, resisting the temptation to pursue individual opponents when it would compromise his ability to support the overall mission. By early 1945, Bud Anderson had established himself as one of the war's most successful fighter pilots. His 16 confirmed air-to-air victories placed him among the top American aces, but his most remarkable achievement was statistical. He had completed more than 100 combat missions without suffering any significant battle damage to his aircraft. This unprecedented record wasn't the result of avoiding combat or taking unnecessary risks. Bud had flown escort missions to the most heavily defended targets in Germany, participated in air-to-air engagements against experienced enemy pilots, and undertaken ground attack missions against defended positions. His survival resulted from a combination of skill, tactical judgment, and careful aircraft management that kept him in the fight while minimizing unnecessary exposure to enemy fire. His fellow pilots began referring to him as the untouchable, though Bud himself rejected such dramatic language. He attributed his survival to careful preparation, conservative ammunition management, and the kind of situational awareness that came from treating every mission as a learning experience. He studied intelligence reports about enemy tactics, maintained his aircraft meticulously, and approached each engagement with the calm focus that had characterized his flying since training. The statistical improbability of his record became apparent when compared to average casualty rates for American fighter pilots. Most pilots who completed combat tours had suffered at least minor battle damage, and many had been forced to make emergency landings or bailouts. Some had been shot down multiple times, but managed to evade capture and return to their units. Bud's complete avoidance of significant damage was virtually unprecedented. His 16th and final victory occurred during one of the last major air battles over Germany. A formation of German jet fighters, the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262s, attempted to intercept a bomber formation near Berlin. Bud was flying as part of the escort when the jets appeared, their speed advantage making traditional interception tactics obsolete. The engagement required split-second timing and perfect positioning. The German jets could outrun any American fighter in level flight, but they were vulnerable during their attack runs on the bombers. Bud positioned himself to intercept one of the jets as it completed its attack, timing his approach to catch the German pilot during the brief moment when he was committed to a predictable flight path. His firing pass was perfect, a short, accurate burst that caused the jet fighter to explode in midair. But more importantly, the attack disrupted the German formation's coordination, allowing the bombers to continue their mission without significant losses. This engagement exemplified Bud's approach to aerial combat, individual success in service of larger tactical objectives. The 357th Fighter Group developed the kind of close-knit culture that emerges when men face mortal danger together on a daily basis. pilots shared everything: quarters, meals, missions, and the psychological burden of knowing that each briefing might be the last time they saw certain faces around the table. Bud Anderson formed particularly close friendships with several pilots who shared his methodical approach to combat flying. Chuck Yeager, who would later become famous as a test pilot, was among his closest associates. Their friendship was built on mutual respect for each other's flying abilities and a shared understanding that survival in combat required both individual skill and team coordination. The squadron's social dynamics were complex, reflecting the diverse backgrounds of men drawn from across America. Some were college graduates with technical training, while others had learned their trades in Depression-era jobs that required practical problem-solving skills. What united them was their commitment to the mission and their loyalty to each other. Humor played an essential role in maintaining morale. Pilots developed elaborate practical jokes, inside references, and running competitions that provided psychological relief from combat stress. Bud participated in these activities with characteristic dry wit, earning a reputation for deadpan observations that could reduce entire briefing rooms to laughter. But the brotherhood also meant sharing losses. When pilots failed to return from missions, their absence created holes in the squadron's social fabric that were difficult to repair. Bud learned to commemorate fallen friends without becoming paralyzed by grief, understanding that excessive mourning could compromise his ability to function effectively in subsequent missions. The replacement pilots who arrived throughout 1944 and 1945 required careful integration into established flight teams. Experienced pilots like Bud took responsibility for mentoring newcomers, sharing practical knowledge that could improve their survival chances. This mentorship was both formal and informal. Combat formations were structured to pair experienced pilots with newer arrivals, but the real learning often occurred during off-duty conversations about tactics, enemy capabilities, and the psychological demands of aerial combat. Letters from home provided another crucial element of squadron life. Bud maintained regular correspondence with his family in Auburn, sharing what details military censorship allowed, while reassuring them about his safety and well-being. These letters provided psychological anchors to the civilian world that pilots would eventually rejoin, assuming they survived their combat tours. The war's end in Europe brought mixed emotions for combat veterans like Bud Anderson. Relief at having survived was tempered by the realization that the intense camaraderie of combat units would soon be dispersed as men returned to civilian pursuits. The 357th Fighter Group had become more than a military unit. It was a community bound together by shared experiences that few people outside combat aviation could fully understand. Bud's transition from combat pilot to peacetime officer required significant psychological adjustment. The adrenaline rush of aerial combat, the clarity of purpose that came from facing mortal danger, and the satisfaction of mastering complex skills under pressure were difficult to replace with routine peacetime duties. Many veterans struggled with this transition, finding civilian life frustratingly mundane after the intensity of wartime service. The Army Air Forces recognized that experienced combat pilots represented valuable human resources that shouldn't be wasted. Rather than discharging pilots like Bud immediately, the military offered opportunities for continued service in roles that could utilize their hard-won expertise. Test pilot duties were particularly attractive, combining the technical challenges of flying with the opportunity to contribute to aviation's continued development. Bud accepted assignment to flight test duties at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. This work involved evaluating new aircraft designs, testing modifications to existing aircraft, and providing pilot feedback to engineers and designers. The flying was often more technically demanding than combat operations, requiring precise data collection and careful documentation of aircraft performance characteristics. The test pilot community represented another elite group within military aviation, but with a different culture than combat units. Test pilots were typically more technically oriented, with backgrounds that emphasized engineering knowledge as much as flying skill. Bud found this environment intellectually stimulating, providing opportunities to understand aircraft design principles that went far beyond the operational knowledge required for combat flying. His combat experience proved invaluable in test work. Years of flying high-performance aircraft under demanding conditions had given him intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that couldn't be learned from textbooks. He could detect subtle changes in aircraft handling that might indicate developing problems, and his extensive experience with different aircraft types provided valuable comparative perspective. The arrival of jet-powered aircraft represented a revolutionary change in military aviation, and pilots with Bud Anderson's experience were essential for evaluating these new technologies. Jet engines provided unprecedented power and speed, but they also introduced new operational characteristics that required careful study and documentation. Bud's first flights in jet aircraft revealed both the potential and the challenges of the new technology. Jets could climb faster and fly higher than any propeller-driven aircraft, but they also consumed fuel at prodigious rates and required different tactical approaches. The lack of propeller torque eliminated many traditional handling characteristics, while jet engine response times were slower than reciprocating engines. His test pilot work during the late 1940s and early 1950s contributed to the development of aircraft that would define American military aviation for decades. He flew prototype fighters, experimental aircraft, and production models that were being evaluated for operational use. Each flight generated data that helped engineers understand how theoretical designs performed in actual flight conditions. The transition from World War II to Cold War brought new challenges for American military aviation. The Soviet Union had developed its own advanced aircraft, creating the need for American designs that could match or exceed potential enemy capabilities. Test pilots like Bud played crucial roles in ensuring that American aircraft maintained technological advantages that might prove decisive in future conflicts. His flying during this period was often more dangerous than combat operations had been. Prototype aircraft were inherently unpredictable, with design characteristics that were understood only in theoretical terms until actual flight testing revealed their real-world behavior. Test pilots regularly encountered situations that required split-second decisions about whether to attempt recovery from unusual aircraft behavior or to eject from aircraft that were beyond recovery. The Korean War brought test pilot expertise directly into combat operations. Many of the aircraft that Bud had helped evaluate were rushed into service to meet urgent operational requirements. His knowledge of these aircraft's capabilities and limitations proved valuable in training operational pilots and developing tactics that maximized their effectiveness against enemy aircraft. Bud's continued service during the 1950s and 1960s allowed him to witness and participate in aviation's rapid evolution from propeller-driven aircraft to supersonic jets. He flew aircraft that represented incremental improvements over World War II designs, and others that incorporated revolutionary technologies like swept wings, afterburning engines, and advanced avionics. Bud Anderson's war record generated numerous stories that grew in the telling, as often happens with remarkable achievements. The fact that he had completed more than 100 combat missions without suffering battle damage seemed almost impossible to many people, leading to speculation about how such a record could be achieved. Some stories suggested that Bud possessed almost supernatural situational awareness, able to detect enemy aircraft before they became threats, and to position himself advantageously in any tactical situation. While his situational awareness was indeed exceptional, these stories ignored the extensive training, careful preparation, and conservative tactical approach that actually accounted for his success. Other legends focused on supposed individual duels with famous German aces, dramatic encounters that were said to have lasted for extended periods, while both pilots demonstrated exceptional flying skills. These stories were largely fictional. Most aerial engagements were brief affairs lasting only minutes, and the identity of opposing pilots was rarely known during actual combat. The untouchable nickname generated its own mythology, with some people suggesting that Bud had received special protection or had access to superior aircraft that gave him unfair advantages over other pilots. In reality, he flew the same aircraft as his squadron mates and faced the same tactical situations as other escort pilots. Some speculation centered on the possibility that Bud had participated in classified missions that weren't reflected in official records. While test pilot duties often involved classified aircraft, his World War II service was well documented through standard military channels. The dramatic nature of his actual achievements made fictional embellishments unnecessary. The persistence of these legends reflects the difficulty that many people have in accepting that exceptional performance sometimes results from the consistent application of sound principles rather than dramatic heroics. Bud's approach to aerial combat emphasized careful preparation, conservative tactics, and team coordination, qualities that were less romantically appealing than individual heroics, but more effective in achieving consistent success. Veterans of the 357th Fighter Group who served with Bud generally dismissed the more dramatic legends, while confirming that his actual performance was remarkable enough without fictional additions. Their first-hand accounts emphasized his reliability, tactical judgment, and calm demeanor under pressure, qualities that made him an ideal wingman and flight leader. Bud Anderson's achievements have influenced American military aviation culture in ways that extend far beyond his individual combat record. His approach to aerial combat, emphasizing preparation, tactical discipline, and team coordination over individual heroics, became part of the professional foundation for subsequent generations of military pilots. Fighter pilot training programs incorporate lessons learned from World War II aces like Bud Anderson, Chuck Yeager, and their contemporaries. The tactical principles they developed through combat experience became formalized doctrine that is still taught to military pilots today. Their emphasis on situational awareness, energy management, and formation tactics remains relevant despite significant changes in aircraft technology. The broader American culture has embraced World War II fighter pilots as symbols of courage, skill, and dedication to duty. Bud Anderson represents the archetypal American fighter ace, a small-town boy who rose to meet extraordinary challenges through hard work, natural ability, and unwavering commitment to his responsibilities. Books about World War II aviation routinely feature Bud Anderson as an example of exceptional pilot performance. His combination of combat success and survival makes him an ideal subject for authors seeking to illustrate the qualities that separated the most successful pilots from their peers. His post-war test pilot career adds another dimension to his story, showing how combat experience translated into continued contribution to aviation development. Documentary films and television programs about World War II aviation frequently reference his achievements, particularly the unprecedented record of combat missions without battle damage. This statistic provides a concrete measure of exceptional performance that is easily understood by audiences who may not fully grasp the technical aspects of aerial combat. Aviation museums display aircraft similar to those that Bud flew, often accompanied by information about the pilots who achieved exceptional combat records in these aircraft. The P-51 Mustang has become an icon of American military aviation, and pilots like Bud Anderson are part of the human story that gives these machines historical significance beyond their technical specifications. His influence extends to modern military aviation through the continuing relevance of the tactical and professional principles he exemplified. Contemporary fighter pilots operate in technological environments that would have been inconceivable during World War II, but the fundamental requirements for success, situational awareness, tactical judgment, and calm performance under pressure, remain essentially unchanged. Bud Anderson's approach to aerial combat reflected a coherent philosophy about survival in high-risk environments. Rather than relying on aggressive tactics or individual heroics, he developed methods that maximized effectiveness while minimizing unnecessary exposure to danger. This approach proved remarkably successful and offers lessons that extend beyond military aviation. His emphasis on preparation meant studying intelligence reports, understanding enemy capabilities, and maintaining equipment to the highest possible standards. Every mission began long before takeoff, with careful review of weather conditions, enemy activity, and tactical objectives. This preparation provided the foundation for making effective decisions under pressure. Conservative ammunition management was another key element of his survival strategy. Rather than firing at maximum range or in marginal tactical situations, Bud waited for high-probability shooting opportunities that were likely to produce decisive results. This approach conserved ammunition for crucial moments, while avoiding the attention that came from extended firing sequences. Formation discipline represented perhaps the most important element of his tactical approach. Rather than pursuing individual glory, Bud consistently prioritized team coordination and mutual support. This philosophy reduced individual risk while increasing overall mission effectiveness, creating the kind of tactical synergy that multiplied individual capabilities. His post-combat analysis of each mission provided continuous learning opportunities that improved future performance. Rather than simply celebrating successes or dismissing failures, Bud systematically reviewed his decisions and their outcomes, identifying patterns that could inform future tactical choices. The psychological aspects of his survival philosophy were equally important. Bud maintained emotional equilibrium by focusing on controllable factors while accepting that some elements of combat were inherently unpredictable. This mindset prevented the kind of fatalistic thinking that could compromise decision-making abilities. His attitude toward risk was neither reckless nor overly cautious, but carefully calibrated to mission requirements. He was willing to accept necessary risks to accomplish tactical objectives while avoiding unnecessary exposure that didn't contribute to mission success. This balance required constant judgment calls that reflected deep understanding of tactical relationships. Bud Anderson's later years were marked by recognition for his contributions to American military aviation and his role as a representative of the World War II generation. Awards and honors accumulated over time, including induction into various aviation halls of fame and recognition by veteran organizations. His participation in air shows and aviation events provided opportunities for younger generations to meet someone who had participated in history's greatest air war. These appearances were more than ceremonial. They offered chances for active duty pilots to learn from someone who had faced the ultimate test of aerial combat and emerged successful. The memoirs and interviews he provided to historians helped preserve first-hand accounts of World War II aviation for future generations. These primary sources offer insights into the daily realities of combat flying that complement official military records and provide human context for statistical data about aircraft performance and casualty rates. His influence on American military culture extends beyond aviation into broader concepts of professionalism, duty, and service. The qualities he exemplified, careful preparation, calm performance under pressure, and commitment to team success over individual recognition, represent ideals that remain relevant across military specialties and civilian professions. The lessons learned from his career continue to influence military training programs and operational doctrine. His approach to risk management, tactical decision-making, and professional development provides a framework that can be adapted to contemporary challenges while maintaining connection to proven principles. Modern fighter pilots who study his combat record find relevance despite dramatic changes in aircraft technology and tactical environments. The fundamental challenges of aerial combat, managing complex information under time pressure, coordinating with teammates, and making effective decisions while managing personal fear, remain essentially unchanged. Bud Anderson's story represents more than individual achievement. It illustrates the potential for ordinary Americans to rise to extraordinary challenges when circumstances demand exceptional performance. His small-town background, methodical approach to learning, and commitment to duty reflect values that many Americans see as central to national character. The preservation of his legacy through museums, books, and educational programs ensures that future generations will have access to his example of how skill, preparation, and character can combine to produce remarkable achievements. His story serves as both historical record and continuing inspiration for those who face their own versions of demanding challenges. The censored letters that survived from pilots like Bud Anderson reveal a complex emotional landscape that official military records rarely capture. Writing home became both a lifeline to normalcy and a carefully managed performance, as pilots struggled to communicate their experiences while protecting their families from the full reality of aerial warfare. Military censorship created strange constraints on personal expression. Pilots couldn't mention specific locations, unit designations, or operational details, forcing them to develop coded language that conveyed emotional content without revealing tactical information. Bud's letters to Auburn spoke of interesting flights and meeting new people, euphemisms that his family gradually learned to interpret. The psychological burden of repeated combat missions created stress patterns that medical officers were only beginning to understand. Some pilots developed what would later be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress: insomnia, hypervigilance, and difficulty concentrating on routine tasks. Others channeled their anxiety into obsessive equipment maintenance or elaborate superstitious rituals performed before each mission. Bud's approach to psychological survival involved compartmentalization. He separated his combat experiences from his personal identity, treating aerial warfare as a demanding job rather than a defining characteristic. His letters home maintained focus on family news, hometown gossip, and future plans, deliberately avoiding detailed discussion of combat experiences that might worry his parents. The mail system that connected combat units to the American home front carried more than personal correspondence. It transported hopes, fears, and dreams across an ocean that might as well have been an alternate universe. For many pilots, the arrival of mail was the most important event in their daily routine, providing psychological anchors to the civilian world they were fighting to preserve. Relationships with girlfriends and wives faced unique strains during extended combat deployments. The uncertainty of survival made long-term planning difficult, while the intensity of combat experiences created emotional distance that was hard to bridge through written communication. Some couples struggled to maintain connections across the gap between combat reality and civilian normalcy. Bud maintained correspondence with a young woman from California throughout his combat tour. Letters that reveal his efforts to remain emotionally available despite the psychological demands of daily combat missions. His writing style remained consistent with his personality, understated, optimistic, and focused on others rather than his own experiences or achievements. The contrast between public heroism and private vulnerability emerged clearly in personal correspondence. Pilots who were celebrated as aces in squadron newsletters wrote letters filled with homesickness, uncertainty, and longing for simple pleasures like home-cooked meals and quiet conversations. The gap between public image and private reality created additional psychological pressure for successful pilots. While Bud Anderson completed his combat tour without suffering battle damage, many of his squadron mates experienced the terrifying reality of being shot down over enemy territory. Their stories of survival, evasion, and eventual return illuminate both the dangers that Bud avoided and the networks of resistance that existed throughout occupied Europe. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 357th Fighter Group was shot down over northern France during a bomber escort mission in 1944. His P-51 was hit by flak during a low-level attack on German airfield, forcing him to bail out at dangerous altitude. Johnson landed in a forest area controlled by French resistance fighters, beginning an odyssey that would last 3 months before he reached Allied lines. The underground networks that assisted downed Allied airmen were sophisticated operations involving hundreds of civilians who risked their lives to help enemy pilots escape. These networks, known as rat runs or evasion lines, maintained safe houses, forged documents, and communication systems that could move downed airmen from occupied territory back to Allied control. Johnson's experience illustrated both the effectiveness and the dangers of these networks. Resistance fighters provided him with civilian clothing, false identification papers, and safe houses where he could hide while arrangements were made for his escape. But the constant threat of betrayal or discovery meant that his helpers were risking not only their own lives, but the entire network's security. The psychological impact of being shot down and dependent on strangers for survival created lasting bonds between evaders and their helpers. Many American pilots developed profound respect for the courage of ordinary European civilians who chose to risk everything to help enemy airmen escape. These relationships often continued after the war, with former evaders returning to thank the families who had saved them. Captain Chuck Yeager, who flew alongside Bud in the 357th Fighter Group, was also shot down over occupied France. His escape experience involved hiking across the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain, a journey that required physical endurance and mental toughness that proved valuable in his later test pilot career. Yeager's successful evasion allowed him to return to combat operations, where he achieved ace status before the war ended. The survival rates for downed American pilots varied significantly, depending on where they were shot down and the local situation. Pilots who bailed out over occupied Western Europe had relatively good chances of evading capture if they could make contact with resistance networks. Those shot down over Germany itself faced much more difficult circumstances, with hostile civilian populations and intensive German security operations making successful evasion much less likely. Bud Anderson's avoidance of this experience resulted from his conservative tactical approach and careful aircraft management rather than simple luck. His tendency to avoid unnecessary risks, maintain situational awareness, and disengage from unfavorable tactical situations reduced his exposure to the kind of concentrated enemy fire that brought down other pilots. The intelligence debriefings of returned evaders provided valuable information about enemy defenses, civilian attitudes, and resistance capabilities. These reports helped mission planners identify targets and approaches that minimized risks to aircrew while maximizing damage to enemy capabilities. Bud Anderson's post-war career involved extensive interaction with younger pilots who represented the future of American military aviation. His approach to mentoring reflected the same methodical principles that had characterized his combat flying. Careful assessment of individual capabilities, systematic skill development, and emphasis on professional standards that prioritized mission accomplishment over personal recognition. The transition from World War II to Cold War aviation brought fundamental changes in aircraft technology, tactical doctrine, and operational requirements. Jet aircraft required different flying techniques than propeller-driven fighters, while nuclear weapons created strategic contexts that were entirely new. Experienced pilots like Bud played crucial roles in helping younger aviators adapt to these changing circumstances. His teaching philosophy emphasized fundamentals that remained relevant despite technological evolution. Situational awareness, tactical judgment, and calm performance under pressure were as important in jet aircraft as they had been in propeller fighters. The specific techniques might change, but the underlying principles of successful aviation remained constant. Bud's students at various military schools and training programs consistently noted his ability to communicate complex concepts through practical examples drawn from his combat experience. Rather than lecturing about theoretical principles, he would describe specific situations where tactical decisions had life or death consequences, helping students understand why certain approaches were more effective than others. The Korean War provided opportunities for World War II veterans to pass their knowledge directly to pilots facing similar challenges in different aircraft. The air-to-air combat over Korea involved tactics and principles that were similar to those used over Europe, but with jet aircraft that had different performance characteristics and operational limitations. Bud's influence on Air Force doctrine extended beyond individual instruction to participation in formal studies and policy development. His combat experience provided credibility that helped shape training curricula, tactical manuals, and operational procedures that would influence military aviation for decades. The mentoring relationships he developed with younger pilots often continued throughout their careers, creating informal networks that transmitted professional values and technical knowledge across generational boundaries. Many pilots who learned from Bud later became instructors themselves, continuing the chain of knowledge transfer that connected World War II experience to contemporary aviation. His approach to risk management became particularly influential in test pilot training, where the balance between acceptable risk and unnecessary danger was often a matter of life and death. His combat experience had taught him to distinguish between risks that served larger purposes and those that existed only to satisfy personal ego or ambition. The integration of World War II veterans into Cold War military structures required careful management of different generational perspectives. Younger pilots sometimes viewed veterans as old-fashioned, while veterans occasionally struggled to adapt to new technologies and tactical concepts. Successful mentors like Bud bridged these gaps by demonstrating continued learning and adaptation while maintaining connection to proven principles. The film industry's portrayal of World War II aviation began during the war itself and continued for decades afterward, creating popular images of aerial combat that often diverged significantly from the experiences of actual combat pilots like Bud Anderson. These cinematic representations influenced public understanding of aviation warfare, while sometimes creating unrealistic expectations about pilot behavior and combat dynamics. Early war films like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and God Is My Co-Pilot were produced with military cooperation and featured relatively realistic portrayals of aviation operations. However, the technical limitations of filmmaking and the propaganda requirements of wartime production created sanitized versions of aerial combat that emphasized heroism while minimizing the random violence and psychological stress that characterized actual operations. Post-war films continued this tradition, but added elements of dramatic storytelling that further separated cinematic aviation from historical reality. Movies like 12 O'Clock High and The Bridges at Toko-Ri featured complex character development and psychological themes that were more sophisticated than wartime propaganda, but they still portrayed aerial combat through dramatic conventions that emphasized individual heroism over team coordination. Bud Anderson's reaction to these films was typically understated. He appreciated movies that attempted to show the technical aspects of flying accurately, but he was often amused by dramatic elements that bore little resemblance to his actual combat experience. Real aerial engagements rarely lasted long enough for the extended dogfights that made for exciting cinema, and actual pilots were more concerned with fuel management and formation coordination than with individual glory. The psychological portrayal of combat pilots in films created particularly significant gaps between fiction and reality. Movie pilots often displayed either unrealistic fearlessness or dramatic emotional breakdowns, missing the more common pattern of quiet professionalism and gradual adaptation that characterized successful combat aviators like Bud. Technical accuracy became a persistent problem in aviation films as directors prioritized visual drama over operational realism. Aerial combat sequences featured impossible maneuvers, incorrect tactical formations, and aircraft performance that defied physics. While these elements made for exciting entertainment, they created misconceptions about actual combat flying that persisted in popular culture. The influence of Hollywood portrayals extended beyond entertainment into public policy discussions about military aviation. Popular images of heroic fighter pilots influenced congressional funding decisions and public support for military programs, but they also created unrealistic expectations about what individual pilots could accomplish in modern warfare. Bud's participation in air shows and public appearances often involved addressing these misconceptions, explaining the differences between cinematic drama and historical reality. His approach was educational rather than critical. He understood that films served different purposes than historical documentation, but he wanted audiences to appreciate the actual skills and sacrifices of combat aviators. The emergence of television brought new opportunities for more detailed exploration of military aviation themes. Documentary programs could incorporate actual combat footage and veteran interviews, providing more realistic portrayals of aerial warfare. Bud participated in several such programs, contributing first-hand accounts that helped balance dramatic interpretations with historical accuracy. Modern films about World War II aviation have generally achieved greater technical accuracy, using computer graphics and actual vintage aircraft to create more realistic combat sequences. However, the dramatic requirements of feature filmmaking continue to create gaps between entertainment and historical reality that require careful interpretation by audiences seeking to understand actual military aviation. In the end, Clarence "Bud" Anderson's legacy rests not just on his exceptional combat record, but on his demonstration that heroism often takes the form of quiet competence rather than dramatic gestures. His approach to aerial combat and life more generally offers timeless lessons about how careful preparation, sound judgment, and commitment to others can enable individuals to perform at their highest possible levels when the stakes are greatest. The letters he wrote home, the lives he helped save through tactical excellence, the knowledge he passed to younger generations, and the realistic perspective he brought to popular misconceptions all contribute to a legacy that extends far beyond individual achievement into lasting influence on American military culture and values.